After the podcast, Alice starts scanning, looking on the internet. She's in search of an answer, looking for a why, a pattern. How did this happen? How do I address this situation? What have I been giving my attention to? What kind of attention? She calls a friend.
The way we make sense of a challenging experience is connected to a bias for recognizing patterns from the past. Our relationship to patterns is paired with thousands of years in which things didn't change much. However, in our times now, the patterns we're witnessing are often unprecedented in relation to the past. When we think we can reinvent the future, how much of that reinvention is based on past patterns that are no longer relevant?
Speaking of unprecedented, the Great Resignation saw 4 million people resign in a single week. And then a few weeks later, 4 million more people resigned in a week. It came about in part during the pandemic because many of those 4 million people discovered they could create a living online, which gave them the freedom to quit. Our business as usual frames had us miss the incoming patterns from the future about employee dissatisfaction and the lack of meaning. And as a result, most of the business world didn't see the Great Resignation, an unprecedented pattern, incoming.
Collectively, we've termed the phenomenon of using past patterns in the collective psyche and social contracts as the Overton window. It's a concept in political science and public discourse that describes the range of ideas and policies that are considered acceptable or mainstream in a given society at a particular time. This framework helps explain how certain topics and policy proposals move from more to less acceptable for public discussion and consideration. When we stay within a known window, we can completely miss the unexpected. It can also paradoxically and unexpectedly create a kind of magical thinking that ignores aspects of reality. Daniel, what kind of examples do we have of how this plays out?
Well, how about nuclear energy? An achiever brain frame might suggest that nuclear power is mostly safe and acceptable. Is this actually acceptable? All it takes is one event where the unthinkable happens and human life is no longer viable on our planet. Isn't this potentially a kind of willful ignorance? Don't we willfully ignore climate change, supply chain issues required for food, energy production, the impact of political and social unrest, and warring nations ignoring the dangers of cutting off power to nuclear reactors?
Looking at Dr. Lisa Miller's research again, she's actually mapped the different parts of the brain that are assigned to business as usual and new unprecedented patterns. The dorsal network is the part of the attention network that focuses on the task at hand and picks up on our senses and perceptions. It also filters out anything that doesn't fit within the parameters it's set for the world. This is thought to be the top-down part of the brain. In another part of the brain lives the ventral attention network, which allows for new information to come in beyond the task at hand. This is where sudden breakthroughs and epiphanies happen. Our awakened brain uses the ventral attention network to be present to different patterns, understanding what's happening behind the scenes, and noticing what's outside the expected normal.
The good news is, being able to recognize incoming, unprecedented patterns without overlaying our past is a skill that can be consciously developed through training the ventral attention network. The patterns you notice throughout the day are much different depending on the predominance of dorsal or ventral attention in your day-to-day experience. For example, when you hear the news using mainly your ventral attention network, you won't be satisfied with the surface level of what's being reported. You'll be looking for meaning. You might ask, what's happening behind the scenes? What's good about this? How can this be useful?
So training the ventral attention network could actually give us fresh perspectives. The edge in business is being able to differentiate past patterns from incoming patterns incoming from the future. We have an opportunity to ask a new question that would have us be present to a pattern we haven't been noticing. What frame would you have to be coming from to ask the questions no one's asked? questions that would have us see the patterns of an incoming future.
To be present to the future patterns that are emerging requires a new and very different pattern recognition and new frames. What new perspectives and frames would you need to cultivate? What if the future is not as subject to our frames for assessing it as we might like to think it is? Can we be open and flexible to new frames?
Stay tuned for Alice's adventure in further micro collections.